Please remain standing for the reading of the gospel. Luke chapter 21, verse 25 through 36. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth there will be dismay among the nations, and their confusion over the roaring of the sea and surging waves. The planets and other heavenly bodies will be shaken, causing people to faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world. Then they will see the human one, coming on a cloud with power and great splendor. Now, when these things begin to happen, stand up straight and raise your heads, because your redemption is near. Jesus told them a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see these things happening, you know that God's kingdom is near. I assure you that this generation won't pass away until everything has happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will certainly not pass away. Take care that your hearts aren't dulled by drinking parties, drunkenness, and the anxieties of day-to-day life. Don't let that day fall upon you unexpectedly, like a trap. It will come upon everyone who lives on the face of the earth. Stay alert at all times, praying that you are strong enough to escape everything that is about to happen and stand before the human one. You may be seated.
It is always great to be here at First United Methodist Church, Myrtle Beach, the church that I still consider my home church all these years later. Much has happened in my life since I was first last year to preach, and certainly since I was last year to preach on a Sunday morning. That's been many years ago. I've been back here some on Monday nights, but much has happened, and much has happened here. And I want to say that as you have sustained me through some difficult times with your prayers, and I'm grateful indeed, please know that this great church, her staff, and her people are in my prayers now as you face your own difficult times. And I stand before you to bear witness to this fact. The prayers of the righteous availeth much. And my very presence here is testimony to this fact, friends. Our God is greater. Our God is greater. I don't care what we're facing, our God is greater. And our God is greater than this moment, too. And I'm really happy to be here for this magnificent occasion for the Brittain family. Anna Kate's baptism. The first Brittain baby small enough for me to lift up. For you to see and glory in with us. It's worth being ordained just to get to baptize the family babies, I can tell you. And the whole thing is made all the more special because today is the first Sunday of Advent, the beginning of that season when we prepare our hearts and our lives for the coming of the Christ child, and when we call upon the world around us to do the same. Get ready, world, the Christ is coming. But this job gets tougher year after year. There's just no way around it. It's hard work being the church during the season of Christmas. It's hard enough throughout the rest of the year, but during the next few weeks, at times this task is overwhelming. For in this season, the voices that threaten to silence the church increase in number and in volume. And perhaps most dangerous, they appear in the guise of friend, not foe. Who can object to snowflake and snowman, reindeer and a jolly old elf? Who can argue against buying gifts for loved ones and gathering for times of celebration? Who can complain about decorations and lights? There's nothing wrong with all of that. But with the increase in the number of other voices and the volume with which they speak, the voice of the church is threatened. And friend, in this season, it is absolutely essential that the voice of the church be heard, not instead of other voices, but above them all. That's the work you and I are called to do over these next few weeks. And yes, it is hard work, this being the church in the season of Christmas, this being the voice that sounds out above all of the other voices of the holiday, telling the story of a simple mother and child, of a love that could not be confined, of a promise fulfilled. Being the voice that reminds the world that we only remember the manger because of the cross. That the real meaning of Christmas is still to be found in the Word itself. That Christmas is first and foremost about the Christ. The work is hard. And it's gotten tougher through the years. You know, when I was a child, the church had a lot of partners in this work. Teachers showed those big 16-millimeter movies about the birth of Jesus. Schools actually offered Christmas pageants that focused on the Bethlehem story. Public buildings put up nativity scenes in their lawns. Now, those partners are gone for a variety of reasons, many of which are very good. But their absence has put an even greater burden on the church. We have to tell the story for no one else. Wait a minute, let me rephrase that, remembering one of Daddy's best sermons. We get to tell the story because no one else can. We get to tell the story. Perhaps we never should have depended upon them to do our job, but we did. And I'm afraid in those years, the voice of the church in the world weakened a bit. You see, we began to think of our job as simply celebrating the story within our walls, telling ourselves and our children the story over and over again. We somehow forgot that our work was telling the whole world about the birth of Jesus in ways they could hear and understand. It's hard work, but it's the job of the church in the world today. Hey, it is your job, and it's my job. And believe it or not, there are some who are still waiting to hear that good news, waiting to hear about a promise fulfilled. Now, that promise first came to us from voices that cried out hundreds of years before the manger of Bethlehem. And here on this first Sunday of Advent, we pause to listen to the good and the bad news that the prophets bring, to make sure we remember that those coming stories of John the Baptist and Mary and Joseph and the shepherds, that baby in a manger, are not just some nostalgic subject matter for carol and card. No, these stories matter. These are the hard evidence of a promise made good. These stories make a difference, not just in retail sales reports, not just in the holiday TV lineup, not just in our December electric bills. These stories make a difference in the way we live our lives, or at least they should. The manger matters, for in the manger we discover just exactly what we've been waiting for. We discover a promise fulfilled. Now, there were many prophets who heralded the coming birth, this great intervention of God into the ways of the world, but the voice we've heard today belongs to this prophet Jeremiah. Let me just tell you a little bit about Jeremiah. He lived in one of the most troubled times in the history of God's people. Everything that could go wrong did. And the old Jeremiah was in the thick of it all. No matter what happened, Jeremiah was there. He just prayed, preached, and believed. Around my house, we call him Big Tom. He suffered with the people, and he suffered because of the people. He was oppressed and imprisoned. He was ridiculed and humiliated. And still, he prayed, he preached, he believed. You know, I've always felt a little kinship with Jeremiah since I was a teenager because of the way he describes the touch of God upon his life. In the very first chapter of the Old Testament book that bears his name, he says this, "Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations." In other words, Jeremiah was just destined by God to be a particular kind of person. And there was no way around it. Well, my high school friends pretty much thought of me the same way. You see, I was anything but cool. I was nothing like my brother Tommy. And even though I was not cool at all, somehow I managed to have really cool friends who still accepted me just the way I was. And I remember one time I tried to do something that was just mildly reckless. And my regularly reckless friend, Maureen, looked at me, laughed out loud, and said, "Forget it, Jan. It'll never work. You're doomed from the womb." Made me feel a whole lot like old Jeremiah, because apparently he felt like he was doomed from the womb too. God chose him to be a particular kind of person, a prophet, in difficult times. Jeremiah spent his entire life honoring that call. In the preaching and teaching of Jeremiah, we encounter the promise that will one day be fulfilled in Bethlehem. Jeremiah declared that promise with great fervency and faithfulness. But you know, that's not really what makes him so powerful for folks who are living today. No, you see, he not only declared the promise, Jeremiah lived the promise. See, Jeremiah just decided, I'm going to live the promise before it even happens. I so believe it. I have so much faith in God that I'm going to live that promise as though it has already happened. And that's exactly what Jeremiah did. And folks, that is what you and I are called to do as well. We will learn much from Jeremiah's words, but we will learn far more from his life. For no matter how disappointing, no matter how discouraging our circumstances may be, the faithful are always called to live the promise. And exploring together how Jeremiah managed to do that will, I think, help us understand how we can do it, how we can live the promise too, and how we must if we long for this promise to be fulfilled here among us this very day. Now, I want you to keep in mind that when the Lord makes this promise, the salvation of his people through Jeremiah, the monarchy itself was under threat. The true king of Israel is off in exile in Babylon. No one in the Davidic line sits on the throne, and Jeremiah himself is imprisoned by his own nation. Times are bad, folks. That is what makes the promise so important. You see, Jeremiah's promise cuts through the nation's despair with a word of hope, which is what promises are really all about. Hope. Things don't look good now. Times are difficult. The enemies of God appear to triumph. Cruelty, betrayal, failures, injustice, and oppression mark the stories of our daily lives. Even those who appear to be religious are faithful on the surface only, and the truly faithful are oppressed. But a change is coming. God is still at work, and God will intervene with what? Justice and righteousness and salvation and safety. It's a promise. It's a divine promise that Jeremiah declares, and more importantly, believes. It's this belief that enables him to live out of that promise and claim the hope of the righteous that is yet to come. You know, folks, something really incredible happens at that manger. The past and the present and the future come together in a way unlike any other moment in time. Listen carefully. At the manger, hope for the future commits us to action in the present, which connects us to God's promises from the past. Now, I want you to listen to that one more time. At the manger, our hope for the future commits us to a concrete action in the present and connects us to a promise from the past. In other words, past promise and future hope come together in the manger in a life-changing moment for the present. And that's true for everyone in every generation who truly finds their way to the manger. And it's only when we, like Jeremiah, see hope and promise join hands that we have any chance at all of living that promise fulfilled in our daily lives. So, okay, preacher, sounds good, but what does it look like? I mean, what does that actually look like? What would it look like in my life? Well, I think a quick look at Jeremiah's life will help us answer that. First, and perhaps most obvious, belief in the promises of God and the hope of the future caused Jeremiah to embrace a particular set of priorities in the present. It's pretty simple, really. I mean, it's not easy, but it's simple. When the people all around him were letting the world determine their priorities, Jeremiah chose the priorities of God. When rulers and priests and the common folk alike were allowing circumstances to set their agenda, Jeremiah chose God's agenda. It was not a popular stance. In Jeremiah 8, we read this: "From prophet to priest, everyone deals falsely. They have healed the wound of my people lightly, saying, 'Peace, peace,' when there is no peace." You see, that was the message that they wanted to hear. Nobody wanted to hear what Jeremiah had to say. No, the people preferred preachers who made them feel good about themselves and ignored the sin that separated them from God. And the rulers, they preferred prophets that made them feel good about themselves and ignored the injustice and the corruption that separated them from God. Nobody wanted to hear Jeremiah, for with his promise came warning as well as hope. God longed, God ached for his people to turn back to him and cease chasing after empty, material gods of their own creation. God would not tolerate their unfaithfulness. The priorities of God were stated clearly in the promise. We heard them read. Justice and righteousness, they were the only way to salvation and safety. To his own peril among his own people, Jeremiah chose the priorities of God. Jeremiah lived by the priorities of God, and though they didn't like it, no one could ignore it. Now, I think that's one reason the people and the rulers never silenced Jeremiah. Now, they could have killed him. They could have exiled him. They could have just left him down in that cistern where they put him every now and then. But no, the integrity of his life, the way his living matched his speaking, somehow prevented all that, because deep down they all knew that the words of Jeremiah did in fact echo the priorities of God. And you know, that can never be silenced. Jeremiah chose the priorities of God. He chose justice and right living over the priorities of the world. What I want, when I want it. Without that choice, his witness would have had no power at all. Jeremiah chose the priorities of God. Folks, those who live this promise fulfilled in our world do the same thing. They too choose God's priorities, and they too will never be silenced. Good thing. For theirs is a message that many are still waiting to hear. And Jeremiah didn't give up. No, he kept at it for over 23 years, through a variety of kings, in peace, in war, even during foreign rule. Jeremiah was nothing if not persistent. Now, the Hebrew word for persistent is hashkem, and that word is used 11 times in describing Jeremiah, his life, his work, the message he brought from God. God is persistent, so are God's people. God doesn't give up, ever. People who live out of the promise fulfilled can't give up either. No matter what happened in the world around him, Jeremiah just kept rising up to meet God and to speak the truth to God's people. Persistence is achieved one day at a time. Prolific author Joel Henderson was once asked how he had written so many books. And his answer was simple. He never had written a book. He just wrote one page a day. And when a year was up, he had a 365-page book. Those who live the promise fulfilled are, like Jeremiah, steady and persistent. Look, fads come and go. Worship styles come and go. Preachers come and go. Political leaders come and go. Even the style of Christmas lights, have you noticed? Come and go. But those who live the promise fulfilled just keep on. Keep on declaring the promises of the past. Keep on claiming the hope for the future. The present is what? Their time to speak. They will not be silenced. Good thing. For theirs is a message many are still waiting to hear. We admire old Jeremiah, the priorities he chose, the persistence with which he pursued his work, the way he lived out of the promise. But how? How did he do it? Well, one of the wonderful things about the book of Jeremiah is that it gives us an insider's view of the prophet's life. Look, we don't have to wonder what Jeremiah was doing when he wasn't out preaching. We know what he was doing. When he wasn't proclaiming the promise, Jeremiah was anchoring himself in the promise through prayer. 7 passages in the book of Jeremiah give us a glimpse into the prophet's prayer life. Here, the prophet speaks in first person. He bears his soul before God. And then, Jeremiah listens. Yeah, that part of the prayer we so often forget. How did he acquire the power needed for faithful persistence? He prayed. How did he keep his priorities in line with God's priorities? He prayed. You know, the longer I'm in this preacher business, and some of you are going to hate to hear this because it's going to make you feel real old, it's getting close to 30 years now. Some of you who were around when I started, believe it or not, it's at 29 years. But the longer I do it, the more it seems to me that we spend most of our God time talking about God with others when we should spend most of our God time talking with God about others, our world, and ourselves. Listen to me, friends, if you don't give God time to speak to your heart, if you don't spend time anchoring yourself in the promises of God, how can you expect Him to shape your priorities and guide and direct you? How can you expect His power to enable you to persist in faithfulness no matter what? Through his prayers, Jeremiah was constantly reminded of the promise in the past and assured of the hope for the future. Thus, he could speak faithfully in the present. Now, Jeremiah did do a lot of talking about God, but the power for those words came when he was talking with God. No wonder he could not be silenced. People who live out of the promise fulfilled spend a lot of time talking with God too. And no matter how loud the voices around them, they will not be silenced either. Good thing, because theirs is a message many are still waiting to hear. Prayer, persistence, priorities. They were the hallmarks of a prophet's life who dared to live out of a promise. And they mark the lives of the faithful today who live out of that same promise fulfilled. And beloved, hear me now. There are just no shortcuts. People are always looking for a way, to claim the rewards, the power, the joy, the victory, without running the race. You remember the story of Rosie Ruiz? In the spring of 1980, Rosie was the first woman to cross the finish line of the Boston Marathon. No one had ever even heard of her. And it was just an almost miraculous race. It was her very first race. Her victory was stunning. The magic of fairy tale just surrounded her, along with the cheers of the crowd, the victor's wreath. But then someone noticed the absence of taut muscles in her thighs. And they began to ask questions. No one had seen her in the course of that 26.2-mile marathon. And finally the truth came out. Rosie had joined the race in the last mile. See, she wanted the success without the struggle of a well-run race. She wanted a shortcut to victory. And that's exactly what the people in Jeremiah's day wanted. And what I fear so many want in our day too. The promises of God without the priorities of God. The peace of God without the prayers to God. The victory of God without persistence. Christmas without the Christ. The manger without the Master. But there simply are no shortcuts to Bethlehem. The promise is worth running the entire race. That's the message the world still needs to hear from us, from you, and from me. And beloved, living out of this promise through prayer and persistence and the priorities of God, that's the only hope you and I have for being the voice we're called to be. The voice that sounds out above all of the other voices of the holiday season and tells the simple story of a mother and a child, of a love too great to be confined even in heaven, of a manger that made way for a cross. And like Jeremiah, we too must never be silenced. For ours is a message many are still waiting to hear. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.